Hello and welcome to another episode of Smart Talk. Today we're talking about the world situation. It is absolutely dizzying keeping up with everything. There's uprisings here, military situations there, there's wars, some broken ceasefires, anti-immigrant marches and the growing right wing, financial bubbles and the skyrocketing price of gold, and everything in between. If you're a leftist, I think it's easy to get swept away by the pace of events and, think that revolutions are around the corner. Others bend the stick the other way and think that there's growing fascism. And if you're a politically conscious worker who's genuinely worried, it can feel absolutely overwhelming. Or you can feel isolated because your coworkers have shut themselves off to the news, or they give more credence to conspiracy theories and, quote, fake news. In this context, we here at the show thought it was important to try and make sense of the world around us so that leftist workers can find their feet again and understand what to do to go forward in these unstable times. To talk about all this and more, I have with me Comrade Perrault. Hello.
Hello, Mansa.
Hi. So, big topic. How do we even begin to talk about it? How do you make sense of everything that's happening?
Yeah. I think a reason why there's so much, impressionism, that a lot of people are saying that either we're like in the era of fascism or revolutions are literally starting right now, is that people don't have a broad understanding of what are the long-term trends and how are they operating. And it's if you understand these long-term trends, then you can make more sense and put in perspective some of the shorter-term events that are going on here and there. So I think that's the first thing to really define.
So to step back and look at the big picture.
Exactly.
So what is the big picture?
So the big picture is really, the US has been really dominating the world since the end of the Cold War. And this grip has been weakening. The US's objective power, its economic power, its military power is not as big as it used to be in proportion to the others. And that really is the most important factor in world politics today. And so there are many consequences of this. One is the emergence of other, regional dynamics. Regional conflicts are intensifying and so on. For example, Palestine, Ukraine, a lot of the other wars we're seeing popping around the world. There are expressions of this American power that's weakening. So there's more space for these other conflicts. Meanwhile, what you also see is within the United States and within other Western countries, there's a change in political dynamics because the ruling class needs to change its policies for some that will be more aggressive and more able to shore up the weakening objective position in which they find themselves in. And so the consequences of that in terms of foreign policy is squeezing countries in the global south more. So that's really the kind of broad trends underlying what's happening in the world. And you have to start from there.
Right. I mean, we've talked about this many times, and obviously some of the key documents we have talk about this, which is what's really behind the rise of Trump. It's not workers just suddenly going right wing, but Trump represents the growing needs of the American ruling class to pursue a different strategy to keep America at the top.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. So you've given us a big picture.
Yeah. In very broad
right.
strokes.
Okay. My question still exists. So there's all the stuff happening around the world. Now, I think, at this podcast, I always try and, guide a discussion so that, socialist-minded workers, leftists, so that they're able to, make sense of everything. Like I said at the start, I find personally for myself as well that there's a dizzying pace of events, right?
Yeah.
Like, so I follow South Asia a lot, for example, and, you had Nepal pop off, Sri Lanka last year, Bangladesh, well, not last year, but, a few years ago, Bangladesh, and just literally last week it was Pakistan and Afghanistan. So I can't even keep up with just how to make sense of these things. So stepping back, there's so much happening that it's easy to lose sight of the big picture and then to get carried away like, oh, look, there's all these uprisings that are happening, for example. So this must mean that, okay, well, we're just going to see, more uprisings or revolutions or whatever. So I guess my question still is, right, like, okay, so step one, look at the big picture. Then what?
Yeah. Well, okay. So this is what I was talking about is the objective pressure. The US has objectively less power. But then where it gets more complicated is then you have to look at what are the political dynamics. What are the political trends that are happening on different countries and different regions. Mm-hmm. And that's where you can then understand a bit more what's happening. So if you look at all these uprisings in the global south, now a lot of these countries, I have to say, I don't know very much about, but I think there's a few things that, at least for socialists, should be a bit of a warning and a bit of a tempering of expectations. If you look at what's happened in the last decades in much of the global South, you've not really seen like the rise of a really conscious working class left, but you've seen, in Latin America, left populism,
Right, the pink
really
tide.
the pink tide. And what you've really been seeing as this, the kind of the political outcome of this kind of decline in American power and decline of liberalism as the dominant ideology, you've also seen really a crisis in terms of left populism in Latin America. If you look at the Chavez regime, if you look at Bolivia, Argentina, the left populism is really in crisis. And, you've not really seen like a left working class alternative really emerge from that. If you look at a lot of countries in Africa, the left is not very developed and the working class movement is not very developed, which was not always historically true, actually. But it's actually in South Africa, the left is in a very depressed state right now politically, as your last podcast has discussed. And if you look at South Asia, I think you have, a bit of some similar trends, where a lot of the left has been really imbibing like this NGO liberalism, the regime that came to power in Bangladesh is really that. And then you really have the bankrupt, like the defeat of the Maoism guerrilla strategy as well. You have different versions, the military defeat in India, and then in Nepal, really the total betrayal of the Maoist forces. And so you have these uprisings of really like elemental discontent, but it's not clear that there's not really like a working class left-wing organized force that's there to really kind of bring this further. And at least that's my impression looking at a lot of these countries. And so Nepal, for example, is the one maybe I'm a bit more familiar with. This is really like the defeat of which the left, this uprising is against a government composed of communists, basically. So I think the political forces that are likely to benefit from this are actually probably going to come from the right and from the monarchists. But what's also some of the early reactions to these uprisings has been extreme repression. Like in Indonesia, we've seen that. In countries like Madagascar, it seems like the early result is a government of the military. So these don't point to immediate like revolutionary situations like, the Russian Revolution. But I think these are signs of like revolutionary forces at work, like really the deep discontent of the population. But it's going to take some time for these trends to really mature into conscious, revolutionary, and working class political forces.
Two questions coming off that. I think maybe the first, maybe you just addressed, but just to clarify. I mean, I think one sort of rebuttal like a leftist could make to what you've just said is, well, look at sort of the pace at which these are happening, The global South is, of course, it's nothing new. It's always a lot of misery, underdevelopment, and so on. But why are they all happening right now, for instance, and like really right out, okay, you can say, well, they take influence from there and there and so on and get animated. And that's my first question. And then second, I think it's a question of the point about the working class not really playing an active role and the left not playing an active role. So what do you do in that situation? Like, I guess, why is that key? And maybe that's an obvious question, but why is that key? Because the reason why I ask that is because many will argue that actually look at the youth, situation for youth internationally, I think is absolutely bad. Whether you're in the US, in Britain, or elsewhere in the world, like youth do not have a good future for themselves. So you also start to see these sort of theories that youth are the new vanguard of the revolutionary movement. So those are my two questions.
So in the first question, like why is these all happening at the same time? Okay, there's a effective contagion, but more than that, you're seeing like the processes that are becoming ripe in many different countries, but so in each place, there's like very specific dynamics. But if you put this in the broad perspective of what's happening is like basically all these underdeveloped countries are getting squeezed. The financial and economic conditions are becoming worse everywhere. The opportunities of, progress, if, a decade ago, there was this illusion that there was going to be like gradual development in all these countries. And this has really been shown to be a total farce and not going to happen. The temperature has just been rising and rising and rising, and it's, coming to the boiling point. The point that I think the basic mistake that is made is not because that things arrive at the boiling point that the revolution is going to be on the order of the day.
Right.
There's other ways for the bourgeoisie to deal with these types of situations. And in the global south, historically, it's military dictatorships, and you often have a situation where like uprisings like we're seeing now are not necessarily the, precursor of a left-wing like radical government, but of an instauration of a military dictatorship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So then that brings me to your second question in terms of the working classes, because the working class really is the force that has the power to really instaur a new order. Now, of course, we need to support the struggles of all the various stratas of the population for good living conditions. But the working class is the one that can give it an organized expression and really the political outcome that can really provide a new order. And here's one of the factors that make us less optimistic, if you want, of the overall situation. If you look at the more industrial economies like Mexico or China, even Indonesia, like the uprising that happened, as far as I understand, it wasn't like really in the working class of Indonesia.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not really the sector that moved. Well, that would be a very different thing, if you start seeing the working class of these countries really flex their muscles. Mexico, if the Mexican working class starts to move, that could be a huge, huge factor. Not to speak of China, that could totally transform the world situation. But what you see, and especially Indonesia, I'm much less familiar with, but is that the economic conditions among industrial workers are fairly bad right now. And they don't really, and in a lot of countries, they don't really have the confidence to go on the offensive. So that's important in terms of like the character of these uprisings and their outcomes and their possibilities open to them.
I'm glad you started talking about the economy, because the other big thing I wanted you to address is the state of the world economy. I mean, increasingly, you have more and more articles, right, in the bourgeois press, even like the Financial Times, talking about the bubbles, and this is a bit of a new development, I think, in that they're actually consciously talking about it. I mentioned at the start, gold has never been this expensive, and usually that's a sign of something in the economy. What's your take on where we're headed in terms of the economic situation?
Yeah.
Because also I think that's also key to understand. Ultimately, I want to bring this back to where's the working class at?
Yeah.
Because ultimately, if the working class doesn't feel emboldened to go on the offensive, it ultimately does have some material roots.
The thing is, even when you look at these long-term trends and try to understand them, even as a Marxist, the timing of when these things happen is always difficult.
Yeah.
And that's the case really with the economy as well. So if you look back since 2008, how the ruling class responded to it was really by inflating a huge bubble. And
Printing money.
Yeah, printing money. And really what happened is really the price of assets really rose to a huge amount. Whereas if you look at how much the productive economy is grown, is not really commensurate. And so the talk of bubbles and so on, it comes up and down, even in the commentariat layers. And now it's a bit of a height. So yes, you had printing money, then you had COVID where they did this on a whole new scale again. There's the government also borrowing money that's kind of kept all of this going. And now you've had this huge influx of money into the AI, which is kind of keeping the American economy sputtering along. So it's hard to know when this will all come crashing down. It will come all crashing down. And there are signs that I think, we are running out of steam for all of this. But I think that's also related to what we're seeing elsewhere. What I was talking about in terms of the industrial conditions. Like if you look at the industrial economies of the world, you see the layoffs that are happening already. China, there's a real problem of overproduction, and the conditions are worsening for industrial workers there. So I think you're seeing kind of the early stages of an industrial crisis. But when the penny will really drop and we'll be in a full-blown financial crisis is very difficult to predict.
Yeah. So what's the implication of this for the coming sort of state of struggles? Because I mean, this discussion, as I started at the outset, is we need to make sense of this. Are we going in this direction of revolutions, or are things actually bad?
Yeah.
And I think that's often the sort of the two extremes that it's kind of difficult to get your head around that. So do you think that the current state of the world economy, the sort of way, Trump and American imperialism is turning the screws in the world, is that creating conditions for working class offensives and struggles, or is it really not conducive to that? I guess what's the implications of the economic situation?
I'd say yes and no.
Okay.
Yes, ultimately, the crisis of capitalism, the deep economic depression, these are things that will lead to revolutionary upheavals. That will happen. But the mistake that many who claim to be Marxist make is that they go from this general point that's true to immediate projections, that this will immediately lead to uprisings and so on, or advances for the working class or revolutionary situations. But that's not how it usually works. Often, when there's a huge depression or mass layoffs, like that's not the conditions at which the working class feels ready to go on the offensive. And then there's a whole question also of the political maturity of the working class, where it's at politically, where it's going. And again, here too, I think if you look at the conditions of where the working class is politically in various countries, we can see that it's like a major shock to the system right now will probably not benefit in the short term left-wing revolutionary forces, but rather more reactionary forces. That's kind of the dynamics that you already see at play, really.
Okay. There's so much more to talk about. China is not something that we've talked about recently at this podcast, but also, you mentioned China a number of times about the significance of the Chinese working class and so on. What role does China have to play in all of this in terms of turning the tide potentially, or just, in the world situation?
Yeah, that's a really important question. So a lot of people, view China as like this rising imperialist power, and they understand the world situation as one of, China's rise and US decline. Okay, there's an element of truth. China its power has really increased, but our understanding of China as a deformed worker state and of the bureaucracy as a conservative caste leads us to understand that China is not actually like aggressively trying to supplant the United States. Actually, in many ways, it's propping up the status quo. It's actually, whereas the US is actually trying to really tear it up, China actually wants to keep stability in the world situation. And we think that there's pretty good chances that if, for example, there would be a major economic crisis or something, that China would do it the most it can to kind of keep the overall system running and not use that to, tear down the whole American order. So we think that China is overall, the bureaucracy is overall a conservative force. The world.
CPC.
Exactly.
Right. I think the most sort of obvious way to see this is, there's so many quotes by CPC leaders and so on. First and foremost from Xi himself, talking about how he wants globalization, and globalization is the motor force of history, and this is the way forward and everything. Whereas, Trump and his people are just tariff upon tariff upon tariff, really reversing globalization in real time. And Xi's like, no, let's do the thing. Because why? Well, it's the thing that helped China get where it is currently. Yeah. But
you can see with the conflicts between China and the US over the rare earths, like China actually has a pretty solid hand, but it doesn't really want to play its hand. It doesn't really want to put the real squeeze on the US and really break its global power. That's not what it aims to do. So the CPC is a conservative political force on the world's stage. But the Chinese working class is the most revolutionary factor potentially on the international scene, because it is by far the largest working class in the world, extremely powerful working class. And also, a big part of it is actually pro-socialist. They see, the increased power of the capitalists in China as a negative thing. At least that is a important trend among Chinese working class. I can't really pretend to know this in much detail, but that's quite clear. So I think that's one way that China could really reshape the world politics, is if the Chinese working class gets into motion.
So to link this back to the theme of our discussion, revolutions, or, well, it's called revolutions or fascism, but, are things going in a positive direction? Because you're saying, well, the CPC is currently in charge. It plays a conservative political role. It wants the world situation to stay the same as it has for the last 30 years. So it's sort of acting as a huge drag on the potential for things to turn in a leftward direction. Is that what we would conclude from that?
Now, if there's a huge shock on the world economy and mass layoffs, for example, in China, it will be very important to see how the Chinese working class reacts to that. Like I said, usually when there's big economic depressions, it's generally not good to go on the offensive. At the same time, if there's at a certain point, workers have no choice but to fight. So that will be very important in terms of determining where things go. But right now, and for the period to come, there's nothing to say that, we're not in a situation where the Chinese working class has started to move and we can say, oh, yes, things are going to, turn to the left. Right now, we're in a situation where it's not moving, as far as we can tell anyway, where generally the working class is not on the offensive, where you have these uprisings that are kind of not really organized in terms of a conscious political force. And where in the West, you see really the rise of, reactionary right-wing parties as kind of the main dominant trend there. So if we look at this picture as a whole, we could clearly say, okay, this is not a revolutionary period. Not that that as a whole, there's not trends that are going to push towards revolution. But right now, we're not in a situation where it's the time to go on the offensive, right, for the working class. And it's also not fascism, which maybe we can get into later.
Yeah. And I think crucially in all of this, and as you mentioned with the Global South uprisings, it's really like, where's the left at? Within these developments, right? You can have uprisings, but unless you have a clear political program that's directing all this pent-up anger and struggle in a conscious direction against the ruling class, then it's not guaranteed to go automatically towards a good place either. I just want to, one last thing on China. Since you mentioned the rare earth minerals question, I think many would see this as like, oh, look, inter-imperialist rivalries and like, this is proof. But how you're putting it is really that this is really a sort of, what's the term, tug of war, right? To sort of negotiate their hand, because the tariffs are really not good for China's economy. I was just reading this morning that China's had the slowest growth for a number of years, I think. So the whole playing the hand of the rare earths mineral situation is to try and force the US to back off, as opposed to an expression of inter-imperialist rivalries.
Yeah. The US has basically been able to impose tariffs on most countries without any retaliation. And China is one of the few countries that actually is pushing back in a serious way. But honestly, that would normally be the normal thing for any country to do. Actually, I think Canada is one of the other ones that is in fighting a little bit. But, if we look at the inter-imperialist rivalry thing, it's like, if you look at the world situation, it's actually like, take a bit of a step back and look at it. Like, it's absurd to think that China and the US are like on the same plane here. Like, look at the US supporting Israel's genocide, involved totally in the Ukraine war, bombing Iran, threatening Venezuela.
Oh my God.
Like that is what an imperialist power does. It does war and it dominates other countries through force. Can any comparison be made with China? They have not invaded any country since Vietnam, like decades ago. Like that is simply not the role that China plays around the world. And the only way you can say China is imperialist is if you think that, like, if you view the world really as a liberal, where like force and war doesn't play like a key role in terms of imposing your will on other countries. That purely through commercial means, China is able to dominate and exploit. Domination exploitation always happens through force, through coercion.
What are you talking about? It's finance capital.
Yeah, but there has to be a stick behind that finance capital.
Exactly. I think that's the key point, that many just disappear, just throw out the window, and they really just become accountants looking at export and import of capital. It's not a very Marxist. There's a lot
of countries. China's loaned money to a lot of countries in Africa. African countries, a lot of them are not able to repay. What has China done to get its debt back? Has it sent its ships to collect the debt? No. Usually what happens is the IMF actually steps in, which is an American, basically, agency, and negotiates the deals.
Okay. I think since we're talking about the whole inter-imperialist rivalry stuff, let's talk about Ukraine, this never-ending war. I know Trump's been trying to push through a ceasefire deal, but it's not easy. And just, again, this morning I was reading he's humiliated Zelensky again.
Yeah.
It was 2 days ago he was like, oh, maybe you guys could have the Tomahawk missiles, but now it's like, no, go away. Capitulate because you're losing anyway. So one, I think, first, where's the end in sight? And two, how does this play into the bigger picture about the direction of travel in the world?
I guess just before I answer that question, I think one reason why there's like so much impressionism over like revolution and is that I think there's a bit of this, it's not maybe super Marxist statement, but there's a bit of this feeling in the air that things are turning in the world. That like big things are about to happen. And you can kind of see this with little events popping up everywhere, you know? So you get this feeling on the economy, Palestine, you know, which we can talk about later. And Ukraine is one too. You have this, there's kind of this sense, you know, and it's because a lot of these things that have been building up for years and years are slowly arriving at a point of becoming mature. I think the Ukraine war is a good example of this.
Before you go on, I mean, in a sense, I agree with you, like, you know, this feeling in the air or whatever. At the same time, I'm speaking from experience where I could tell you, like, nobody at work is talking about many of these things in the air. You know what I mean? Like, I think Palestine's a bit more distinct because a lot more liberals talk about it. But last time anybody brought up the Ukraine war, couldn't tell you. Or, you know, just the Venezuela, like just any of these things, couldn't tell you. So there is this disconnect as well. And I think we should also talk about later the middle class, which is kind of in this like sort of bubble and about to be burst. But anyways.
But you know, okay, different people follow the news to different extents, but I think something that's quite like common is this sense of impending dread and doom for the future. You know, I think that is becoming quite a strong sentiment, including in the middle classes. We can talk about later, like this whole like panic about like fascism and so on. That's really a trend there, you know, like it's not necessarily that people that they follow every single item of news, but there's this sense, this broader sense that like things are not going in a good direction and bad things are coming. You know, I think that's quite a sentiment.
Yeah. Anyways, so back to Ukraine and Russia. What's the situation and what can we expect in terms of the direction?
It's the same, but more. Like the direction travel is the same. It's, you know, Russia's winning. Russia's grinding down the Ukrainian army, but it's doing it at a quicker pace than it did before. And again, we're like slowly inching towards a turning point on the battlefield. Now, the negotiations, I think, again, it's kind of very secondary. What's happening between Russia and whatever Trump says, that's really determined by what's actually happening on the battlefield. And that's what's happened on the battlefield is that Russia's hand is becoming stronger. And so that's just, you know, that's reflected in Trump's attitudes towards Putin and Zelensky and so on. Although, you know, there's like zigzags all the time. But that's the overall direction, is that...
So do you think we're looking at an imminent Russian victory? Well, maybe not imminent, but like an eventual Russian victory?
I think we're going to be seeing an acceleration, like continue seeing acceleration. And I think at some point, and like, again, it's like a bit like the economy. You can't really predict when, but you're going to see a collapse of the Ukrainian army.
And implications of that for the dynamics in Europe?
Major.
Just Eastern Europe in general?
They're going to be quite major. I think it's going to be a total political catastrophe for the different European governments that really stake their whole fate on the Ukraine war. Like, I think the most important thing will be to see how the US reacts. My guess is that it's probably going to look to some kind of deal with the Russians, and you know, we'll see it. But I think we could see quite a profound change in the political dynamics in Europe.
This is something we wrote about. We produced a memorandum a few months ago, and one of the sort of predictions, and predictions are predictions, but you know, along the lines of what you're just talking about, that there could be a sort of like a conservative stitch up in like the US and Europe. But maybe you want to elaborate on that just a little bit, because for me, it's more like, well, what would be the interest of the different actors in having that outcome?
Yeah. Well, the US's goal in terms of reshoring its position, you know, like, you know, the US has had a turn towards like conservative, more authoritarian government. And it is trying to have governments in Europe that will be politically aligned with its interest. And, you know, a deal with Russia, between the US and Russia. Also, you know, there's certain alignment, political alignment between some of what Putin stands for and some of what the Trumpists, you know, conservative, religious, you know, very anti-LGBTQ, you know, that
the
kind
Christian
of thing.
right is a thing that I think gets underplayed in discussions, but I think I do think that's significant.
And you see as we discussed already, a lot of the political parties that have the momentum in Europe are these right-wing, reactionary, sometimes
anti-EU,
you know. So, you know, Russia doesn't have an interest in like a unstable Europe, you know. That's always been when it gets invaded, you know, is when there's, Europe starts becoming unstable. So it doesn't per se have an interest in that. It doesn't have the strength to invade Europe and reshape the global order, as a lot of people claim again. Since the beginning, its main thing it wants to do is to come to a better deal with the Americans, to establish the real border with NATO and stop basically the expansion of NATO to the east. And that's, anyway, the US at this point, the whole Ukraine war shows that it cannot extend its influence in the east. Mm-hmm. And so if it's able to recognize that fact, and that's the big if it can kind of swallow its pride and recognize that no, it cannot extend and it has to come to some compromise deal with Russia. And if they're able to make such a deal, it could really put Europe in kind of the deep freeze in terms of politics, for some period of time, you could see a quite reactionary Christian right order in Europe. That would be the outcome of a deal between Russia and the US and the rise of these right-wing political forces in Europe. Now, this is a possible scenario. I'm not saying this necessarily. There's a lot of things that can make that not happen, but I think why it's important to think about these types of things is to kind of understand what are the various forces
behind events.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, predictions are predictions, but I do think the analysis you lay out, I mean, obviously it makes sense to me as part of the discussions, but okay. The thing we haven't talked about so far, which we absolutely need to, is Palestine.
Yeah.
Palestine ceasefire. There is a ceasefire, although it's been violated. But I want to rewind a little bit because, again, one of the things that happened in the lead up to the ceasefire really actually coincided with it was the whole events in Italy and then the Sumud flotilla. And that seemed to have given a bit more of a spurt to the pro-Palestine movement and so on. And, it's 2-3 weeks later and we don't hear anything.
Yeah.
But so there's what to make of the ceasefire, because I think it's a bit naive to think that this is the end all be all. And then second, to make sense of what way forward for the Palestine movement, because you had all this sort of flurry of excitement and now it's poof into the air. And well, that's my take anyways.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's an important question. I think in terms of again, when you look at world events, you have to distinguish what are kind of the primary forces at play and what are the secondary forces at play. So if you look at the Palestinian conflict and the main thing that's been happening in Palestine itself is really Israel grinding down Gaza, committing its genocide there and aggressively attacking all the neighboring countries and the members of the Axis of Resistance.
And Doha.
Yeah, even Doha. And the truth is that it has inflicted the pretty devastating blows, Hezbollah and on Hamas and the Syrian regime collapsed. So that's kind of one of the main factors if you look at the conflict in that region. Now, and so I think a lot of the kind of excitement around the flotilla and the events in Italy, I think they were a bit masking what was actually really the most important thing happening during that time was this Trump deal, which was really an ultimatum for basically total capitulation of Hamas. And Hamas basically agreed to this in principle. Now, here's where it gets more complicated. There's a big difference between the beginning of this process and this process actually ending anywhere near to what's, written on a piece of paper. So the most likely outcome, and that's been what keeps happening with these ceasefires, that Israel breaks the ceasefire. It got the hostages, and so we'll see, how long this lasts. But basically, Israel holds all the cards. As for Hamas, I think their position is really quite weakened, and they're more or less said that they are accepting to withdraw from political power in Gaza eventually and disarm and so on. And so we'll see if this ever comes to pass. But the fact that they say that they're willing to do this kind of shows the weakness of their position.
Yeah, I mean, it's something to, again, this is what they've said, right? So what happens on the ground, that's separate. But the fact that you've waged, after the Al-Aqsa flood, you've had this 2 years of the resistance against the Zionists. And then all of a sudden you're just going to capitulate. It doesn't make sense from their point of view. I think the only thing that could make sense is that they're completely out of cards.
The truth is that Hamas has been ready for a deal for quite some time. And it's the fact Israel that has refused. And it's probably only because of pressure from the United States that finally it's actually accepted something. But even then, if, to how committed is Trump to really ensuring peace? He got a political win with getting the hostages and so on. So how much does he care about the fate of Gaza? Probably not very much. So if the Israelis want to keep going, they're going to keep going. And they've shown this already.
Let's talk about what next for Palestine. We put out a leaflet that said, kill the deal, the ceasefire deal, right? Can you take us a little bit into that?
Well, it's not just the ceasefire. It's really the whole plan put forward by Trump. Because, of course, we want the killing to stop in Gaza. But the key thing is to change the relationship of forces, in the balance of forces in favor of the Palestinians against Israel. And that has to be the aim. And to just accept this, ultimatum of capitulation really just weakens actually the pro-Palestinian side. Because not only does this, the hostages are now released, Hamas has agreed to disarm eventually. We'll see if that happens, of course. But the other thing it does is it really demobilizes the international movement in support of Palestine. So what we said is that instead of accepting this deal, what really was necessary is really an appeal to mobilize against the deal and against this oppression of the Palestinians. In particular, in the Muslim countries around where, there's very, very strong pro-Palestinian sentiments and where the regimes are actually pro-American.
Jordan.
Yeah, Jordan, Egypt, Turkey. But what we point out in our leaflet is that Hamas is refusing to basically appeal to the masses against these pro-American leaders.
The best ally that the Palestinians could have in action.
Yeah, the most kind of immediate, like if they want to immediately change and improve their position, that's something that you could do. Like if there would be millions of people in the streets in Egypt and Istanbul against the governments and for Palestine, that would immediately improve the negotiation, the hand of the Palestinians.
I want to just highlight one of the things you just said in that sentence is that against the government, right? Because I think Turkey has been one of those places where there has been actually significant pro-Palestine marches, but mobilized by Erdogan himself sometimes, I guess. So I think the key, and I think this goes internationally to the pro-Palestine movement, that these marches have not been explicitly against the governments of these countries. I mean, to just drop Britain, like, okay, fine, maybe they all hate Starmer, but then do they actively fight to break with anything that, links them up to the government? No. John McDonnell, Labour Party MP, often headlines them and so on and so forth. So it's like, how are you actually fighting against the government and linking that movement, far away to the cause of Palestine? I think that's what's been missing.
That's really what's decisive. And that's okay. So maybe in the Arab world, Muslim world, that's where you'd get the most immediate results. But that also is what we advocate for in terms of the West, is that, the Palestinian movement needs to have some teeth. And that's why it's not had the political impact that it, even sometimes there's huge demonstrations. It's not really had so much political weight because the movement doesn't have teeth really. It's all based on like appeals to consciousness, to humanity, to whatever, and not like, as a fight against the ruling class of this country that is creating these conditions and also sinking the working class at home. That kind of movement could be much more powerful for the Palestinians, but also help improve the situation of workers domestically. And that's the big problem is this, that we explain in this leaflet, is the disconnect between the working class and the Palestinian movement. Now, this brings us to maybe Italy, where it seems like that's not the case, where the working class is actually at the vanguard of the fight for Palestine. And there's what's interesting with the case of Italy, and I think why so much hopes are drawn from the case of Italy, because it seems to be indicating the contrary, that
the working class is mobilizing for Palestine.
Exactly. Yeah. And that is true to some extent, and that is obviously a positive thing, that the dock workers and so on mobilized and that there's this general strike. Like these are, of course, positive developments. But you have to understand what's their origin and, what's happening. So again, I'm not very familiar with political conditions in Italy, but how I understand what happened more broadly is that there's been this, I think part of the Trump's negotiating tactics for Palestine was to let the Europeans make some noise on Palestine. So, you had a whole carnival where like everybody declared they recognized the Palestinian state, and, some of the parties like, the Social Democrats in Germany and the Labour Party in Britain, they kind of changed their tune a little bit, started speaking a bit, more harshly against Israel and so on. Of course, this think this was really just one big maneuver to kind of, at the end of the day, isolate the Palestinian resistance when it came to the deal, because everybody supported the deal. Everybody, almost basically every government on earth.
Yeah.
But before, so that's why they kind of opened up this kind of divide and so on. And so I think there are like quite specific conditions in Italy where the Meloni government did not really play into this kind of liberal European human rights stuff. So she was a bit at odds with the rest of what was going on in Europe. So I think that kind of opened up a space for this kind of pro-Palestinian movement, somewhat also in opposition to Meloni. But I think the key question to ask for Italy is this: like, is this the beginning of a waking up of the Italian labor movement in an anti-Meloni direction, or is this kind of a bit of a last gasp of the old Italian left, if you want, of like the typical kind of one-day general strikes on a kind of a liberal kind of slogans and so on? And my inclination is that it's really the latter. The truth is that, Meloni is still quite popular in a lot of the working class. Although there were workers present and a lot went on strike, what our comrades told us is that it was actually quite difficult. We had conversation with trade unionists that said it was quite difficult to mobilize for the demonstration, that a lot of workers didn't want to. Other some industries, very few workers actually went on strike.
Yeah, there's pent up. I mean, we did a podcast on this called Italian Workers Strike for Palestine. And one of the points that Comrade Perrault made was that there's been a lot of just built up grievances over time where the trade unions haven't lifted a finger.
Yeah.
As the Italian working class saw, its standards being just crushed and crushed. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, let's general strike for Palestine. I mean, it's not something you're going to immediately jump at, because these are dynamics that really turn the workers away from the unions.
Yeah. So we'll see, but we'll see what happens. I hope, obviously, that I'm wrong on this, and that we'll see a big working class uprising against Meloni and for Palestine that will continue. But early signs don't seem to point in this direction at all, actually.
Well, not at all, but also now that there's a ceasefire, it's hard to say when the next sort of Palestine marches are going to be. Like, are they going to exist now? Are they? I mean, it depends again on what happens on the ground. But I feel like this is, you pose it as, is it the beginning or is it the last gasp? I mean, I kind of agree with you, but we'll see. I think it's contingent on what actually happens with Palestine and Israel.
These uprisings, like the uprising in the global south, or this kind of working class strike for Palestine, what this has enabled the left to do is to not draw any kind of lessons. So instead of confronting the hard truth, that the Palestine movement is isolated from the working class, instead of confronting the truth that we're actually going into a very reactionary period, the left has really latched on to these examples to deny the actual trends that are happening.
Right, because it gives them more proof for their current course.
Yeah, so you can just kind of deny this reality, and that's why they latch on so hard to these events, because they kind of allow them to keep kind of denying reality, and that's why it's quite staggering, actually, like the divide between what the left says in terms of like Red September, and we're like entering like literally a revolutionary period, and the actual feelings among the working class, which is very negative, very feelings of isolation, despair, like are very, very strong right now. So these are two completely different worlds.
I definitely agree.
Yeah.
Speaking of the working class, maybe let's start moving a little bit to, I don't know, maybe not so much the conditions, because we've spoken about that. But one thing that we see definitely in the West is this whole phenomenon of rightward shifting workers and fascists.
Yeah.
That anybody who thinks in somewhat right-wing ways signifies the growth of fascism. I mean, let's not look, there is real scary stuff happening out there, but there are these arguments that we're seeing neo-fascism or the rise of fascism and so on and so forth. What do you make from all that?
I'll answer that by just continuing a bit on the last point again, which is again understanding what are the main trends and what are secondary trends. So if you look at what's in the West, what's the main political trend that's been happening is what you see is the collapse of the liberal kind of center that dominated politics over the last decades. And the main force kind of bringing this center down is an insurgent right wing. Like that's the main political dynamic. But like as a consequence of this main political dynamic, you do have secondary dynamics. So you do have a lot of the people or trends in this liberal left, liberal center that in reaction to this crumbling center are moving to the left. So that is also a trend. It's important to understand where this move from the left comes from. It doesn't come from the rising working class militancy, but it comes from really like the crisis of liberalism. And so that's a bit of a sub-trend. You do also have like actual fascists kind of sprouting out as a trend within the broader rise of right-wing reaction.
Mm-hmm.
But when we speak about fascism, what we're talking about is like paramilitary terror on the streets. Now, this has grown in the, as a product, as I said, of the rise of the right in general, but that's not the dominant thing that's happening. The main obstacle for trade unions mobilization is not, bands of fascists attacking picket lines.
Well, let me ask you to just flesh out like a basic understanding, like a materialist understanding of what fascism is, because liberals will call lots of things fascist, which are not fascist, right? So for us to make sense of the point about attacking trade unions and so on, we need to understand what exactly is fascism, right? Mm-hmm. So you said, okay, paramilitary gangs, but like they're really, their express purpose is to crush working class organizations, leftist organizations, right? Yeah. Because they're perceived to be a threat, right, to the interests of the ruling class.
Fascism is really a product of decaying capitalism. Mm-hmm. And it really emerges when like normal police powers, military police powers, are not sufficient to clamp down on the working class mm-hmm. and the oppressed. And so that's where the bourgeoisie resorts to extra-legal paramilitary forces that come mainly from declassed petit bourgeois elements. So they whip up these layers in a frenzy to kind of crush the working class organizations and minorities through violence. That's what Italy, Germany, that's it's really the product of failed revolutions where, the government couldn't just resort to, police measures to kind of clamp down on the sharp class antagonisms and had to resort to these bands mm-hmm. to kind of reassert its mm-hmm. dominance.
So as you were saying, I mean, the sort of major obstacle to working class action.
Yeah.
Well, one, you don't see working class action.
Not much.
But what am I trying to say? I guess the point is like the problem right now is not that the working class is restive and struggling and needs to be reined in, but that it's relatively inactive in the grand scheme of things.
The main problem is that much of the working class in the West supports the right-wing forces that are emerging. Right. So that's the main problem. So of course, if you look at Britain, a lot of workers support Tommy Robinson, which is on the more extreme, I'm not saying all or even not a majority, but that's an important trend. Mm-hmm. Whereas how many workers support revolutionary parties? Like that is like...
Or Corbyn for that matter.
Yeah, that's very, very, very little. Mm-hmm. So the ruling class doesn't need to use paramilitary force to go against the left. Mm-hmm. Actually, police, force is more than sufficient to do that, mm-hmm. because there's not much strong social forces behind the left wing. Like what's there was the liberal bourgeoisie, and the liberal bourgeoisie could kind of lean to the left. But now that it's not doing that really anymore, what's this really the social basis for the left? It's like students, and there's still some radicalism there, but students too, it's like, it's a matter of time before the governments really cut the budget. They're already really in the US really tightening the screws.
Absolutely.
And you see that kind of already everywhere, like freedom of expression and the ability of the left to kind of be a factor on campuses is being really clamped down on. So what are the reserves, the battalions and reserves that the left has to bring to bear? Well, not much.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so you've laid that out, but again, to link it back to the theme of this discussion, are we or are we not going towards a direction of fascism or revolution? Like, what's the overall conclusion?
Well, we could say in very general terms, yes to both. But specifically right now, that is not the main thing that's happening. Right now, what we're seeing is a rise of right-wing reactionary regimes that are increasingly using state power, force, to crush any kind of form of opposition. So increasing Bonapartist tendencies. Increase repression, increase reaction, but we're not seeing, fascist militias marching in the street like or constant occurrence. And we're not seeing, the starts of a proletarian revolution or even a mass proletarian uprising in the West.
So in this...
Or anywhere, not just the West, really.
Yeah. in this context, what should workers and the left do?
Yeah. Well, the left should just wake the hell up because it's really setting itself up for an even bigger disaster than would normally happen. Because it's, it's like the stairs are going down and it's trying to go upwards. It's like it's going to break its neck totally. Because instead of preparing itself for really what is to come politically and in various other ways, legally and so on, it's really pushing, for offensives and so on, which really will leave it in a more exposed and vulnerable position. So the left really needs to wake up to the reality of the situation.
Okay.
For the working class, I think it's a very difficult position, and the frustrating truth is there's not like an easy thing you can do to get out of the current situation. The key is to understand the situation, like what is really happening. That's really important because it allows you to actually put things in perspective, to not be taken over by like the immediate feelings of like despair or frustration.
Anger.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the things I experience is a feeling of annoyance at coworkers because I'm like, hey, wake up, know? But, I think there's a real tendency to want to shut yourself off from the world. Why? Because it's like overwhelming and depressing. But that's not good. But I think, as I mentioned at the outset, there's a feeling of isolation that you're kind of like doing your thing by yourself and nobody else seems to be really interested when, in the working class, you're supposed to be struggling together with your coworkers but your coworkers on a slightly different planet. So there is that. And I think it can be quite difficult.
The key is that although, we're Marxist and we think the subjective factor can really have a decisive role to play in events, the intervention of individuals can really have a decisive action. Like it's that itself is not like actually dominant. You can have an impact in relation only to objective circumstances. And the key thing to understand is that if things are shit and if nobody wants to fight, it's not your fault. There's nothing you can do by own will to overcome really deep objective forces.
Well, are you being objectivist then?
Well, no. Like what you can when the subjective element can have an impact, it's when it aligns with deep objective processes. So if you're out of sync with the way the wind is blowing, there's nothing you can do to change just the direction of the wind. That said, if you're if the wind is going in your direction and if you set up your sail properly, that's key, because then you're actually aligning and directing the objective forces. So when this anger is bubbling up, then it's looking for an outlet, then it really makes a difference if it has somebody that can direct it in a positive direction that will guide it correctly, or if it's just going to dissipate or explode. I would really recommend the article that our comrade in the US just wrote, Dig In, Don't Give Up, which is really an article directed at really the advanced layers of the working class in terms of the perspective they should have right now.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Speaking of, we recently saw millions, apparently, of people walk for the No Kings protest.
Yeah.
I wondered if you had something to say on that. And why I raise this is because, obviously, it's the US that's turning the screws in the world. And to the extent that you see any resistance to Trump, it really takes the expression of this. So what do you make
I'm sure it's going to be the occasion for a lot of leftists to deny again that anything bad is happening and that this is the revolution that's coming or something. But the truth, and I think even some on the left will have no choice to recognize this, is that the resistance to Trump is quite weak. These demonstrations, as far as I understand, they're like a mishmash that go from Republicans to the far left, and they have no political coherence in their opposition to Trump. So they try to kind of get together over this No Kings thing. But that's not the main thing is that the US ruling class needs to shore up its position and that both wings of the ruling class are agreed in terms of that aim. And so they'll, the actual resistance, like the working class resistance to Trump is more or less inexistent or very, very weak as far as I can tell.
Again, because a lot of the workers pro-Trump.
Yeah. My sense of these demonstrations are they're very upper middle class Democratic Party demonstrations.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the slogan kind of says it all, right? Like, no kings, we want democracy, which is kind of what the pro-Democratic Party anti-Trump resistance has been, not just this term, but the previous term as well. Okay. Look, we talked about a lot of these things now. I do want to raise one last question because I think it's a huge deal. Venezuela. Now, I have We will be bringing to you another episode, which I'm recording soon, with comrades from our Mexican section on Venezuela and what's happening there. But I do wonder what your take on that is, because that is yet another military situation in, and like going against Venezuela. That's a big deal, I think, and really a big deal for all of Latin America.
I think you have, again, it's what the US has been doing already for years, but more extreme. Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of maybe can summarize what's happening and what the US is doing on a global scale. It's like it's been oppressing Venezuela for decades, like it tried to get rid of Chavez, Maduro for like a long time. And so now it's the same thing, but it's just cranking up the pressure even more. Now we'll see what happens. I think it's pretty clear that right now the US doesn't have enough troops mobilized to like have a full-scale ground invasion of Venezuela. That said, they could do like targeted operations, bombing campaigns, and so on. They could obviously create havoc and even more in Venezuela. But it's part of the US really, trying to shore up its position, get rid of a regime that's been a thorn in its side for a long time in Latin America.
But I mean, this is really a huge provocation to all of Latin America.
Yeah.
Right. So do you see that there's potential for this buildup to galvanize the deep going like anti-imperialist sentiment and, turn it into a bit of a anti-imperialist struggle?
Yeah, that's certainly possible. And I think, again, in the long term, everything the U.S. does in terms of ramping up the pressure on Latin America is going to create a counterforce, a revolutionary kind of the basis for a real revolutionary uprising against U.S. imperialist tyranny in all of Latin America and Central America. Like that will happen. Now, that's, again, to go back to the main theme, there's a difference between that happening immediately and in the long term. So it's, kind of impossible to predict exactly what the immediate consequences would be. The general winds in Latin America, as far as I can tell, don't seem to be blowing towards the left. At the same time, if you look at what happened in Venezuela, like these open threats are certainly kind of galvanizing a big portion of the population to defend their country against the United States.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay. So I think to wrap up, let's step back and look at the bigger conversation. So our theme was really, what's the direction of travel? What's really happening and how to make sense of this flurry of events that are constantly happening and quite disorienting. So, I mean, I'd like to ask you to summarize just a little bit what you think is a direction of travel and anything else.
Yeah. With the Trump presidency, you've seen a real shift, a shift away from the liberal world order to a new order. That order is not yet established. So we're in this frothy period of transition. And it's this kind of ups and downs, the zigzags that make it very hard to understand where's up, where's down, and where you have these prognostics that really go all over the place. But if we understand like that the broad direction we're going to is one where the US is, going towards a more authoritarian, reactionary, aggressive posture. Most of the Western governments will kind of coalesce around this. And where from the global South, you don't have yet a like strong, unified kind of counterforce, then you can see why this period, what's coming, is not going to be really a good one in the short term. It's going to be, a more reactionary period, more difficult, more repressive. Now, this will create revolutionary opportunities, but that will take some time to mature.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I appreciate the way you put that. And you mentioned this, I think, a couple of times during our discussion, which is, the left will say wars are a crisis of capitalism. This is a crisis of capitalism. Like, this is a decay of capitalism. So revolutions, like, okay, those are all true things in a world historical sense, but you really have to see things in terms of like the level of abstraction. It's like something that is true ultimately doesn't mean that it's going to play out that way in the next months or years even. And most fundamentally, like, you have to take things as they are, right? And I think the most glaring thing that you have to really address if you're a leftist, if you're a socialist-minded worker, is that what is the state of the left? The left internationally is in a gigantic state of disarray. And all these different sort of groups have their own heads in their own individual sandboxes. And if the left remains in the state, then whatever opportunities do arise, unless you really have the left grappling with these fundamental questions, we can't guarantee that these opportunities will be taken advantage of,
What you're seeing actually happen on a small scale in the last couple of months, actually an increase in the rhythm of splits among the left. In Japan, there's been some major, major splits, and some others internationally.
Well, the Brazilian section of the RCI has just split.
There's a split in the list as well. The truth is that, as you say, like the left is in a very profound crisis, and the changes that are going to happen in the world situation will deepen these crises. For us, and where we think we have a role to play is like we want to kind of come out of this mess where the Marxist left is strengthened. So we want to help, get some clarity from this whole mess, and really avoid too that the whole generations of Marxist cadre get totally wasted and demoralized from crumbling organizations, from scandals. Japan, the splits in Japan, they're all about sex scandals and so on again, which really gives no political clarity and very difficult to then point a way forward from those types of organizational collapses and splits.
Yeah. And, I do think this is really one of the key purposes of the show, which is to try and provoke more of a discussion, put forward our viewpoints in a more accessible manner. And, we don't proclaim that we have all the answers, but we do, to the extent that we do, we'll fight for them. We're willing to be convinced otherwise.
And we'd be more than willing to have a debate with any other left organization that would like to.
Including if you want to come on the show, give you equal speaking time and everything. No, absolutely. I think for me, one of the most pertinent things to come out of this is really, look, of course, there's a limit to what the masses will tolerate. Of course, there will be uprisings, but to take advantage of them, to push them in a good direction that advances the interests of the working class internationally, you need a conscious Marxist force. And the Marxist left, as you said, needs to wake the hell up.
Yeah. Okay. The objective process is really the dominant force in history. The economic forces are dominant, but they will not lead to the creation of conscious parties objectively. Yeah. And I think that's one of the big mistakes groups like the RCI make. They say, okay, look, the situation is revolution objective, and now all we need to do is kind of open our arms, and then the revolutionary masses will come to us. But that's not how you build a revolutionary party. You have to build it consciously by drawing lessons from actual events, and really providing leadership means guiding the course of the class struggle.
Okay. Well, on that note, thank you very much for helping us to make sense of things. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.
And I'll link the relevant articles we've discussed in the show notes. And as always, please do follow us on our various X and Instagram handles. Our international X account is called @SpartacistICL. And we'll come back at you soon with another episode.